Hello everybody, my name is Michael Obsatz, and I am Professor Emeritus from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I taught sociology and education for 40 years. I've been working in the area of men's and boys' issues for probably close to that 40-year period, since probably the 1970s, so 40 years of that kind of work. Looking at what happens to boys, raising nonviolent children in a violent world, which was the book that I published in 1999 that won the Minnesota Book Award, but really looking carefully at what happens to boys as they're growing up and how they become men and what kind of men they become and what happens to them as they grow older. So I'm going to start sharing some things with you. It's a sort of compilation of a whole lot of ideas from a lot of different people, and I'm going to try to make it cohesive and brief so that people can understand why some men are so hurting so bad inside. One of the books that comes to my mind right away is Terrence Real's book, I Don't Want to Talk About It, which is a book about men and depression. Another book that comes to mind is The Wonder of Boys by Michael Gorion. But one of the first books that I ever read about men and men's issues was The New Male by Herb Goldberg, which was written in the 70s. And the thing about Herb Goldberg is he just laid it out there. And he talked about how men are socialized. And I'm going to share a little bit about that to start. Women bend and men break, he says. The blueprint for masculinity is a blueprint for self-destruction. It's a process so deeply embedded in the male consciousness that awareness of its course and end has been lost. The masculine imperative, the pressure and compulsion to perform, to prove himself, to dominate, to live up to the masculine ideal, in short, to be a man, supersedes the instincts to survive. The diagnosis of chauvinism is superficial. Closer examination of a man's behavior reveals a masochistic, self-hating, and often pathetically self-destructive style. The brittle male conducts his life by his ideas about masculinity. Living up to the image is the important thing. Though moment-to-moment experience may be painful and generally unsatisfying for him, his mind is continually telling him what he is supposed to be. As his isolation and distrust, the hallmarks of successful masculinity, increase, so do his drive for power and control and his inner rage and frustration. Traditional masculinity is largely a psychologically defensive operation rather than an authentic and organic process. A man's energy is used to defend against rather than to express what he really is. So he's trying to prove that he's not feminine, dependent, emotional, passive, afraid, helpless, a loser, a failure, impotent, and so on. He burns himself out on this never-ending need to prove because he can never sufficiently prove it. He would sooner die than acknowledge the things that threaten him most, and yet his deepest imprint is feminine, for it was a woman, not a man, who was his original lifeline and his deepest source of identification when he was a baby and a young boy. Now that's pretty powerful stuff. It says that there is a masochistic aspect to the masculine imperative to be a man. There's also a sadistic aspect, and along with this comes a high level of competition. Now, I have a concept called empire consciousness. And empire consciousness is about control, domination, and people in power, having power and control over other people who are weaker or less powerful. And you see that in lots of cultures, historically, empire consciousness. So this masculine way of being, as it is taught to young boys in America as well as other places, fits in with how to be part of an empire and how to have empire consciousness. And as long as we stay in empire consciousness, we are going to continually have wars, aggression, hostility, depression, addiction, shame, and anxiety. So it's almost like boys are programmed early on to live up to an image from the outside and give up their internal sense of who they are on the inside. And this loss of self, of real authentic self, is what drives political powers and systems. It drives a lot of men who are in situations where they are oppressing, bullying, and hurting other people. Now that's a whole lot to take in right there. I think there's two interesting things about this that I want to share. First of all, that there's isolation and distrust, and how important those two things are. Isolation and distrust. Because, and also if you can never sufficiently prove it, it becomes an addictive system of more is not enough, and I need more and more and more. So it fits into Ann Wilson Schaef's concept of when society becomes an addict. So we have societies that are addicts because they're empires, and empires are always addicts, and empires are always shame-based. And part of this masculine imperative to be a man is a shame-based system, which basically says if you don't follow these rules and act this way, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're going to be ridiculed, criticized, ostracized, and marginalized if you don't fit this. Now, this comes from a whole lot of places. It comes from families. It comes from media. It comes from cultural norms. It comes from all kinds of environmental situations where men are put in situations where they are supposed to die for their country, not care about how they're doing or what's happening to them, sacrifice. So here are some effects of male socialization messages. These are the kinds of things that guys are taught. Image rigidity involves control, domination, and power over others. It involves the objectification of self, because you become a success object and a power object. Therefore, it's hard to see other people as real people. So other people are objectified also. We talk a lot about the objectification of women, but men will do that to women when they are also objectified themselves, because that's all you know. Another quality is emotional numbness and dependency. It's interesting, emotional numbness is being out of touch with emotions. And the way that shows up is boys are not supposed to cry, boys are not supposed to demonstrate any kind of vulnerability. And yet they're supposed to be connected as fathers and lovers and husbands and grandfathers and uncles, and they're supposed to care. Well, how do you care about others when you've been taught not to care about yourself as a real person? There's also glorified violence and aggression. There's disposability, which we talked about before, which is you're supposed to sacrifice yourself for others. There's devaluing the feminine within oneself and within others. So whatever is defined as feminine behavior is seen negatively. One other thing is pseudo-independence. I can pretend I know where I'm going even if I get lost. I'm not going to ask for help. And then there's the sexualization of affection, where there's a lack of affection and real closeness and emotional connection, and it is sexualized. It is made into a sexual way of relating. So men are going to have a lot of issues around their sexuality because of what they're taught. These early years, from birth to, say, 15, there's a whole lot of time where there's a lot of input put into boys. And then they go to school and they're taught to do their own work, be independent, and be rowdy on the playground. What's interesting is they're given a kind of a double message, because their earliest years they're very often taught by women. So it's really kind of interesting that being a boy, you're supposed to be tough and do your own thing and be really independent, and yet there's a woman in your life who is telling you what to do all the time, whether it's your mother, whether it's your grandmother, whether it's your woman teacher. Because the early grades, certainly up to third or fourth grade, or maybe even later, are primarily female teachers. So what happens in this early time is you learn that your boy behavior is necessary, but it could get you in trouble. It's a real mixed message about do the rowdy thing, but don't get caught. Control other people, but do it in a subtle way so you're not punished for being a bully. We have a lot of boys who are bullies, and we have a lot of girls who are bullies. So girls are affected by empire consciousness too, by this idea of power and domination. But it shows up a little different for girls differently for girls, because they are more sideways with it. They're more indirect with it. They don't physically as much beat up on each other, although they can emotionally beat up on each other. There is this long period of time where young boys are subject to this hierarchical idea of who's in power, who's stronger, who's weaker, who's in control, who's not in control, and the idea that the pecking order becomes very, very important. And very often athletics has something to do with that, in terms of if you're not athletic and if you're not coordinated, it's going to be harder for you to prove your manhood, because manhood is very often proven on the field, whether it's the football field or the hockey rink, or any kind of sporting event. There is an internal sense, as a boy is experiencing this growing up, that there's something being lost here. Like, why am I doing all this, and who am I doing it for? But also, we're not going to talk about it. We don't talk about how we feel. We don't talk about what this means, that I can't cry. Now, I think it's really important that you talk and share what is going on with you, and you process things with other people. That is how we really learn. So a lot of skill development of emotional well-being, a lot of emotional skills and emotional intelligence does not get communicated as well to boys, because they're not supposed to be emotional in the first place. So what goes on here in the loss of the authentic self is a grieving process that takes on many forms. So let's look at just briefly what is lost in this process. There's a loss of intimate connections with self and with close family and with friends. There's a loss of emotional outlets, crying, showing fear, being vulnerable. There's a loss of trust in other males who will tease you or shun you or betray you. There's a loss of what are defined as feminine qualities: nurturing, being gentle, being caring. And I think that both men and women are capable of what are defined as masculine qualities and feminine qualities. You learn that you don't really have power over your own destiny, that you're going to be defined by other people, and it's external validation for your achievements and your successes. It's a loss of support. It's a loss of learning to appreciate the process of growth, of development, of thought. The ability to understand nonverbal cues and messages. The loss of being able to ask other people for help. It's basically an isolation and distrust of self and others, which Erik Erikson says that trust is the most important thing to develop in the early years, the first 5 years of life. And when a boy is taught that he can't really trust himself and he can't really trust other people, and he has to be independent and not rely on anybody, it can lead to the exact opposite of that, which is total codependency, total needing other people to validate me. So it's interesting because on the one hand, it encourages this facade of independence, which I call pseudo-independence, but it really, in the process of that, leaves a hole in the boy's heart, which he needs to fill in whatever ways he can. And that may be in a relationship with somebody else, it may be in addictive behavior, and what we end up seeing, according to Terence Real, is a lot of depression. And we have to remember that depression is part of the grieving process. So two aspects of the grief process are anger and depression. So boys are kind of set up to become angry and to be depressed. That is really sad to think that they are put into a grieving process for their wholeness, a grieving process for their authentic selves. And as a result of that, the loneliness and the isolation, the feeling of worthlessness, the shame, can result in aggressive and hostile behaviors towards self and others. And I wonder, in terms of the kind of empires that we've seen, how many of the leaders of the empires had holes in their heart where they weren't feeling love for who they really are and decided they needed to have power and domination over others to prove something to the world or themselves. And so what's inside becomes outside. So whatever dysfunctional behaviors we start seeing out there has to do with individuals inside not feeling whole, not feeling loved, not feeling valued, not feeling appreciated, not feeling connected, and not feeling nurtured. Now, nurturing is a really important quality that you need to grow when you grow up. You need to be guided and nurtured through life. There are going to be a lot of situations where you don't know what to do, and you're going to need some help. You're going to need guidance and help and information about how to navigate life. One of the problems with being independent too early is some boys and men never learn how to navigate because they're never taught by anyone else. This is the importance in some cultures of elders, because the role of the elder is to teach younger people how to navigate their life situations. How do you navigate your work life? How do you navigate a relationship? How do you navigate an illness? How do you navigate? And guidance is really crucial. And in order to receive guidance, you have to be able to ask for help. You also need to have people around you who are willing to give you support and help. So the cost of this to cultures is we create hierarchical societies where there is all kinds of isms like sexism, racism, ageism, ableism, heterosexism, and on, because whenever there are people at the top who need validation because of their power, they are going to use and hurt people at the bottom to keep them down there and also to have power and domination over them. So domination is really a response to internal emptiness, pain, and lack of connection. So the only way we can move to oneness consciousness, where we are connected to each other, is to get past the idea that we are totally separate and we are only valued externally for what we accomplish. we have to be valued for who we are from the inside out. So other costs due to this hostile, aggressive male socialization process are depression, isolation, and loneliness, a lack of attention to physical health and earlier death, a lack of self-esteem, unhealthy, unsatisfying, unfulfilling interpersonal relationships, lack of fathering, father absence, lack of trust, addiction, addictive behaviors. Because addictions are distractions from inner pain. If people felt lovable, connected, valued, and had meaningful lives, they wouldn't need to binge on anything or continue to use something that gets them into an alternate reality. The reason people want to go to an alternate reality is their own internal reality doesn't really feel very good. So a number of people have written about this, and I'm just going to share a few of them. Alice Miller wrote a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, which is all about abandonment, hurt, pain, and suffering that kids go through. I wrote an article called The Trauma of Proving Manhood, and I think it's really important to understand that trauma comes from this male socialization process. Trauma is part of this connection from self and others, and also the abuse and the hostility that you experience as a young boy, the lack of learning and support and guidance. The child doesn't say, oh, I'm a child of the universe and I am lovable, but these people just don't know how to love me. The child says, there's something wrong with me. And other books about this would be Terrence Real's I Don't Want to Talk About It, Michael Gorion, The Difference in Learning Between Boys and Girls, Barbara Coloroso, Kids Are Worth It. Barbara Coloroso talks about the importance of the backbone family, and in the backbone family, everybody is valued for who they are, which means she's basically assuming that that in a family where there is self-discipline is taught, there is also love and connection and appreciation and value put on children. So the brittle male conducts his idea by his ideas about his life, by his ideas about masculinity, is very interesting because the ideas about masculinity don't serve well in a very complex world. They're too narrow, they're destructive, and they're isolating. So if we want to raise spiritually connected boys and men in a culture that is an empire culture, we have to go against the cultural norms and say, yes, it is important to be strong, but it is also important to be vulnerable at times in certain situations and be able to ask for help when you need it. Yes, it is important to be to hold back sometimes if you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be punished for letting it all out. But it is also important to find safe places where you can be loved and cared about and nurtured for who you really are. So I'll share with you some ideas of what a spiritually connected man looks like, and we'll end with that. Because what we need to do with boys is we need to teach them to be spiritually connected, personally connected, and interpersonally connected, and loved. And they need to love themselves first. They need to love life. They need to find meaning and purpose. And when you find meaning and purpose, what you do in life becomes significant, but it doesn't define who you are. Because who you are is a child of the universe and a beautiful child. Now, for some people, they would say it would be a child of God. And I think, depends on a person's belief system. So, a spiritually connected man focuses on love and not fear. A spiritually connected man lives in oneness consciousness, not empire consciousness. A spiritually connected man has no desire to control, dominate, shame, or manipulate other people, but sees the beauty in other people, the value in other people, and reaches out to other people, especially people in need. A spiritually connected man cares about others and also cares about the earth. It's interesting, our attitude toward the environment and the earth is also related to our attitude toward ourselves and how we see our own lives. A spiritually connected man is a compassionate leader and an effective team player. A compassionate leader is one that doesn't need to dominate, but one who stands for principles and demonstrates healthy ways of coping with complex situations. A spiritually connected man pays attention to outcomes of his own behavior. In other words, he's accountable and responsible for what he does, and he is able to see the implications of what he does and the effects on others, and he tempers how he treats people based on the idea that he is responsible for his own actions. He doesn't need to be the center of attention. He can go about his life quietly being a light and sharing that light and shedding that light on others and showing the lack of support and love that exists in the world, pointing that out and trying to help people mobilize to become loving, caring, compassionate, and generous with each other. So part of wholeness and being spiritually connected means living in the moment, enjoying the beauty of everything around you, and knowing that your life has meaning because you care about yourself, you care about others, and you want the best for everyone. And that includes all people of all backgrounds and all races and all sexual orientations and so on and so on, all ages and so on. And we are no longer defined by our external characteristics. We are defined by our oneness with each other. So the male socialization process is still going on. It was in existence way before I was born, and I'm going to be 80. And I think it is still affecting boys and men. And as long as there's an internal hurt and shame and longing, there will be an external violent response. Dave Decker, a buddy of mine, wrote an article called The Shame-Rage Connection. He says rage always comes out of shame. There is always a shame-based system that is producing the rage that is going on in the world. Another thing about a spiritually connected man that is really important is the belief that there's enough to go around, there's abundance, and we don't have to live in scarcity and fear. So that is really powerful. I hope you have found this to be an interesting way of looking about how we're raising boys and what needs to change. I think a lot of what was written in the 60s and 70s and 80s about male and female socialization still exists today, and we still need to overcome a lot of the biases and the limitations that have been set up by somebody to create more of an empire. Because unless we do something about that, we are going to destroy everything. We have to care about everything in the world in order to save the world. And that's what this is about.